I came across an interesting podcast with the chief technology officer of Spotify, and this is a good example of when we say reading is part of the business. We mean not just reading in a sense, reading novels, but reading, listening to podcasts, or visiting people, interviewing people. It's all part of knowledge acquisition and inspiration and forming your mind. And this is a good example. We have no interest in investing in Spotify whatsoever. We've declared that company as not interesting for us from an investment perspective, but that doesn't mean the people aren't interesting, and he's certainly one of those interesting people. So he said something that I want to talk about a little bit, and he said that you could look at music and the Spotify service as a reinforcement learning problem, where the agent, the Spotify, is constantly playing music, and the people react to the music, and you kind of create this incentive system where you with the goal of having people stay on the system for longer and also not cancel the subscription. So this is, and by the way, there's a very high correlation between engagement, in the sense that the more you listen, the less likely you are to cancel the subscription. So this is a reinforcement problem. But the way I like, the reason I like this is the reinforcement problem can be applied to almost anything, to politics, to business. I'm reading The Open Society and Its Enemies by Karl Popper, and you could say government is a reinforcement problem, in a sense that the definition of democracy for Popper is just changing rules, changing institutions without violence. And you could say the same thing, you iterate along the political spectrum without violence. We've said many, many times that disruption is basically defined by the amount of iteration. And another word for compound interest is it's basically a function of iteration, which is, you could see that as a reinforcement learning problem. So I want to talk about all these aspects in today's episode. This is not even on podcast. It's May 13th, 2022. This is Krim Telco. For the day, we're up 4.9%. The market's up 2%. For the year, we're down 37%. The market is down 16.2%. We're underperforming by 20.8%. We had a little bit of a correction reversal in terms of the large sell-off in stocks, in particular Tesla, and our biotechs have recovered quite a bit. Actually, our biotechs have recovered a lot because we had positive news on Caribou, which had a good study on CAR T-cell cancer treatment, which is great. And we've said that many times. The reversal will come either from fundamental data or from M&A, and this is now fundamental data. The stock is up 30%, which, given how much it's down, is not that much, but still it's quite a bit. The stock went from 26 to 8, and now it's back to something like 11. So it's still down a lot, but of course the recovery, we believe, will be very, very strong because the data will drive the stock. Having said that, before we go into today's discussion, let's talk a little bit about technicalities. The purpose of this podcast is to give people a sense for what it feels like to run a hedge fund. Our main risk is China. And by the way, another risk that we have, which is funny is maybe the wrong word, but interesting, it's kind of a similar problem like Twitter, which is we have a lot of bots. We have a lot of robots that trade in the financial markets. And those robots can do crazy things. And this is exactly what's happening right now. We have sell-offs in stocks, we have extreme moves and all that stuff. And the problem that we have at Orange Capital Partners is we have a little bit of leverage. And leverage is the only thing that can really kill us. Now, leverage is, of course, we borrow against our stocks. Leverage is also our cost structure, the daily expenses. All of that is leverage. And we've always said that we at Orange Capital Partners have to have the same lifestyle and the same attitude towards life as the investment companies that we invest in, because, at the companies that we invest in, and that is we have to be frugal and humble, and our cost structure always has to be in check. We, just as a side note, we spoke today with one of our customers who asked us about Rivian, and this podcast is by no means any investment advice. Do your own work. But we just spoke about Rivian, and the problem that we have with Rivian is simply their costs are way too high. Their R&D costs are through the roof, and relative to their revenue, and that's a problem. So, companies that have too high of a cost structure, in our view, are just not good companies. And then, of course, if the unit economics don't work, then it's even worse. But let's get back to the discussion. We have reduced a little bit of our leverage today. The goal is to keep our leverage under a certain percentage. This is the goal. This is how we're going to manage the fund. Now, there's still a black swan risk left here, that of course if we could have one day a move of, let's say, 70%, 80% in the stocks, and that could destroy our wealth. Certainly very unlikely, but nevertheless, I mean, you have to well, you have to take it seriously, of course. You have to take it seriously in a sense that we could have maybe a news that there's fraud or something like that, something along those lines that could drive down Tesla stock, which is our largest position, to extreme values, and then we could be wiped out. I mean, that is a risk. So the question now is, of course, well, is it worth having a little bit of leverage for the risk of being wiped out? And the answer to that is it's probably, given in the kind of market that we are right now, it's a questionable risk reward. Nevertheless, we don't want to lose our focus. The fundamentals of Tesla are great. The pricing of Tesla is good. The profitability is good. And the main risk is either some algorithmic mistake or some fraud that comes out of Tesla. Now, hopefully, again, we don't have resources or technology to test that. So it is very difficult for us to assess if that is even a possibility. And unfortunately, that's part of almost life, that if you commit to something fully, you have to also take the consequences into account. And the consequences could be that you can die. It's the same if you surf or ski or do something like that. You try to minimize your risk, but there's always a chance that you could die. And of course, the leverage is a very dangerous thing, even if it's small. And what we're going to do, like we said, is we're going to manage the leverage in such a way that we keep it under a certain percentage, and barring any black swan event, we should be fine, and we would just have less earnings, but still manage the fund in a way that we can survive. Now let's get to the discussion of today. The CTO of Spotify was talking about an iterative game, the iteration of music and users. And I think it's a nice idea because it applies to almost anything. Let's go one by one. Let's talk about products. You could say a Tesla car is a reinforcement learning problem where you have a hardware and a software, and because it's software and because it's updatable, because it's over-the-air updatable, you can iterate, you can continuously bring new features, you can change things and see how people react, create incentives to keep the people more engaged, either through software or through hardware. Software makes it a little easier, or you can have hardware that is programmable, so that way people have more optionality and the iteration can be faster. So this is, if you want, reinforcement learning is nothing but iteration. We've said many times that we believe that the future of self-driving is going to be reinforcement learning, in the sense that AlphaGo Zero is driving self-supervised reinforcement learning and therefore is able to, let's say, play Go. That's the way we see also the self-driving technology hopefully can be driven by self-supervised reinforcement learning in an animated way. And we believe that machine learning driven animation, something along the lines of DALL-E, hopefully will deliver that kind of animation that we then can use self-supervised reinforcement learning. But let's get back to the concept of reinforcement learning. Like the CTO of Spotify said, any business can be looked at self-supervised reinforcement learning. And if you want even a little bit more meta, if you take Karl Popper and his definition of democracy, which is that we have this sort of micro bottom-up attempts to continuously change and improve and change ideas for better ideas, replace institutions with better institutions without violence. That's in a nutshell, that's the same thing like iteration. So iteration is at the fundamental for wealth creation, because the difference between a totalitarian state or a totalitarian company or a totalitarian economy or a static economy, which is in my view all the same thing, is actually iteration. Or a company that is not growing, a company that is not getting better, a company that is not developing along the lines of getting better and all these things. Companies like that, they lack iteration, and therefore they will not prosper. So wealth creation is compound interest. Compound interest is a function of iteration. So if you can find a way to iterate and lower the cost of error correction, lower the cost of failure, of course, but particularly error correction, which is kind of the same. It's not exactly the same, because you can have the cost of failure can be a crash, and then the error correction is, okay, how expensive is it for me to get out of that situation into a better situation? So you want to lower all these costs. You want to have a company that can function along the vectors of iteration, error correction, and so on and so forth. And that is the fundamental idea of our investment thesis. That's how we invest. That's how we think. That's why David Deutsch is part of our in principle stack, because his book, which is a modern interpretation of Popper, is all about iteration. Now he talks at the beginning of Infinity. He explains explanatory power that we have as humans that enable us to do things and really do everything that is possible under the laws of physics. And that's just that's of course a very big picture way to say that, as if you find a way to iterate, if you find a way to fix stuff, get stuff, replace ideas, technologies with better ideas and better technologies, if you can find a way to do that with low cost of error correction, then you have a chance to to do. There's no limit to what you can do, and of course that is very highly correlated with wealth creation. We've also said that part of the iterative aspect of life is computation. Computation is, if you want, just a very elegant way of exploring counterfactuals. Should I go here or should I go there? Should I do this or that? Well, how about I try to find shortcuts, compute my way through this problem, and find mathematically, algorithmically, find ways to answer questions. Should I go left or right? A good example would be a map. A map is nothing but a bunch of computation that tells you, okay, you should go here versus there. You could do it without computation by just trying blindly, but that would be very expensive, and you would be in principle pretty static, because you would, if a billion people would drive around the Earth without any map, it would be something like a random walk, and people wouldn't really produce anything. So my point here is that I just find this idea of iteration and the concept of iteration as a whole very, very powerful, and I just wanted to share my ideas and how I see how it sort of threads its way through all the aspects of life, politics, investment, business. So to summarize, our fund has a drawdown of 37% for the year, driven by massive sell-off in stocks, particularly our growth stocks. We have reduced a little bit of our leverage. We are conscious of the risk that a black swan event could wipe us out, so we have to be very careful about that. It's unfortunately the kinds of things we have to think about. Tesla could be a fraud, or algorithmic trading could bring the stock down by an accident. So those are risks that we have to take into account. And one way out of this is to have runaway money. We're not there yet. Maybe it is something we should be thinking about, but we're not there yet. So having said all of that, what we're trying to say here is the following. We believe that the business and the principles on which our investments are built are all sound. The fundamentals of Tesla have never been better. The risk is China. If China laxes its COVID policies, we have a good chance to get out of this, and the stock can be 1,200. Tesla stock can be 1,200 at the end of the year, or even higher. If not, then of course we have to manage our leverage, which we will manage in a way that we will keep it under a certain percentage. The percentage, I don't want to disclose this here, but it's a fairly low percentage. In the hedge fund business, it would be considered very low leverage. The other thing I discussed today was the concept of iteration, inspired by an interview I heard with the CTO of Spotify, who considers his business kind of like an iterative business. Like he offers music, people listen or they don't listen, then they change. And I think iteration in the concept of reinforcement learning is at the core of any kind of wealth generation product, any kind of wealth generation endeavor. Iteration and reinforcement learning, which are almost the same thing if you keep it general enough, are a basis for progress. And this is what I'm sure David Deutsch, Karl Popper would sign, as much as a statement that they would sign, as much as also Elon Musk would sign it. How do you iterate? You iterate by finding a way to iterate fast at a low cost, and in particular also a low cost of error correction. If you can find a way to do that, you need software, and computation can help you on that way. But often it's also driven by, let's say, your cost structure, your ability to take risks and losses, which is also driven by a cost structure. All these things have to be in place, and then you have the basis for a wealth creating process. Thank you.